In the 12th chapter of the book of Hebrews, after the writer has discussed the various people of faith who led the way for us, he says, now we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. You and I are the recipients of the baton that they passed on to us in this relay race. They are a part of the race that all of us are running for God. And so here he calls them a great cloud of witnesses. Now, they are not spectators. I remember when I was growing up that they always said, well, this is a big coliseum where all of these great people are looking down on us as we run. No, the word is not spectators. The word is a cloud of witnesses. And they are running with us. They have run their portion, and they are helping us to complete our portion as well. So Joseph was one of those of whom the writer of Hebrews spoke in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. About 22% of the book of Genesis deals with this fellow Joseph. More is said about Joseph and Abraham than any other characters in the entire book of Genesis. It's made up of 50 chapters, and of those 50 chapters, about 22% of them deal with Joseph. So Joseph is an important fellow. He is one of the runners who has gone on before us, and he is one of the runners who has passed the baton on to us. Let me tell the story very briefly before we look at the text itself. The story of Joseph is basically this. He was the favorite son of his father, Jacob, and Joseph was kind of the fair-haired boy. Joseph was one who was sold as a slave by his brothers, and they took him to Egypt. He worked very, very well for a while for Potiphar, and then he was falsely accused of making overtures to Potiphar's wife, and he was thrown in jail. In jail, he became a very good inmate, and there were a couple of servants of the king who were also in jail. They had dreams. And so Joseph interpreted their dreams, showing that one was going to be returned to his original position, but the other was going to be executed. And surely enough, the dreams came true just exactly as Joseph had said they would. Joseph said to the chief baker, who was restored to his position, said, remember me when you are back in your work for the king, because I'm here on a false charge. Well, the baker forgot all about that, and it was not until a number of years later that the king had a dream. He had a couple of dreams, and he didn't know what these dreams meant. And then the baker said, oh, I remember when I was in jail, there was a man there who interpreted my dream. Maybe he can interpret your dream, because what he told me about myself came true. And so they called Joseph, and Joseph said, your dreams mean that the country of Egypt and the whole area is going to have 7 years of 7 years of plenty, and then there'll be 7 years of famine. So he said, you better appoint someone and a responsible person to be in charge of all of this. And the king was very wise, the Pharaoh, and he said, what better man would it be than to appoint this man Joseph to this position of caring for the bringing together of all of the crops so that we'll have enough for the 7 years of famine. Well, when the famine came, his brothers and his father and the whole family, they were suffering from the famine. They didn't know anything about it. And so they came to Egypt to get grain. And when they came to Egypt to get grain, then Joseph was the one that they had to buy their grain from. They didn't know who he was, because years had passed, about 22 years had passed since they had sold him as a slave, as a 17-year-old boy. Now, when all of this was over and finally Joseph made himself known to his brothers, The father finally died, and the brothers were afraid. They were afraid that Joseph was now going to punish them. So I want to read just a little portion of the last chapter of the book of Genesis. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all of the wrongs that we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you shall say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers of the sins and the wrongs that they had committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of your God." And when their message came to Joseph, he wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, and they said, "We are your slaves." Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he restored them, and he reassured them, and spoke kindly to them. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing that Joseph was that kind of man. What we want to see tonight is how the faith of Joseph really worked into this. So much of the time we talk about Joseph as a teenage young boy, 17 years old when this all started happening, and we forget about the fact that he is recognized so heavily as a man of faith. So what about his faith and the moral, ethical life that he lived? Well, somehow or another, we don't really know just how. We don't know what was involved here. But somehow or another, he was taught, up until the time he was 17 years old, he was taught something about the importance of fearing God, the importance of believing in God, the importance of trusting in God. And so, when he was finally sold into Egypt at age 17, and he went to work for Potiphar, Potiphar's wife was very much attracted to this 17-year-old boy. And so she tried to seduce him. Stop and think of what many people would think of as a response to this. When this woman tried to seduce Joseph, Joseph could very well have said, "Well, all this stuff about God and God taking care of me and so forth, it didn't work, did it? I got sold as a slave. All of these things about ethical, moral living that my father had taught me, that my mother had taught me, they don't amount to anything because God really forsook me and allowed me to be sold as a slave." And there are all kinds of things like this that could have stood in the way of Joseph being a moral and ethical, upstanding man as he grew up. But the point is this, that Joseph's faith was so strong that he did not allow the temptations that were so prevalent in their world and so prevalent in our world, he did not allow those things to interfere with his faith in God. Well, what about the origin of our ethical and moral standards? Somehow or another, society just decides for us what's good, what's bad, what's right, and what's wrong. And we have all kinds of illustrations of this. Society says abortion is perfectly all right. And so the Supreme Court ruled, yes, abortion is perfectly all right. Now, if you are against abortion, then you're a bigot of some sort, because society has decided that it's all right. Well, actually, a lot of people in society did not decide that. And the same thing is true about same-sex marriage. And the same thing is true about a whole host of other things. Morals and ethics are not decided by society. Morals and ethics have to have an external source of authority. Otherwise, what is wrong in one generation is all right in another generation. What is right in one generation is all wrong in another generation, because society is so flexible and society goes according to what society wants to do. And if society wants to live an immoral life, then first thing you know, that becomes an accepted thing in that society. Now, contrast that, although, with the fact that God doesn't change. What is right in the sight of God is right. What is wrong in the sight of God is wrong. Paul was talking about the law of Moses. And when he was speaking of this, he said, what is the purpose of the law? Now, God's law comes from God. It isn't like laws of our land where we can change them around to suit ourselves. What then is the purpose of the law? The law of Moses we talk about. It was added because of transgression until the seed should come to whom the promise was referred. Well, what does this mean then? It means simply that human beings are not capable of making all of their own moral, ethical laws. And so God gave a law to guide these people. It was added because there was so much evil. It was added to make a discipline for them so that when Christ came, they would be prepared for him. Now, unfortunately, they didn't follow God's law. But the purpose of God's law was that here is something that is unchanging. Here is something that is the way it's supposed to be in God's sight. Not in man's sight, but in God's sight. So Joseph's faith, when he went down into Egypt, Joseph's faith is what got him to make the right ethical choices. Now the same thing is true with us today. We have to have such strong faith that when problems come up, instead of conforming to whatever is popular in the world today, instead of conforming to the worldly thing, we say, no, I can't do that. Oh, everybody does it. It's a generally accepted thing. No, but I can't do it because God says don't do it. Or I have to do this because God says I must do that. And so our ethics and our morals have to originate not from ourselves, not from our culture, not from our society, not from our legislatures, but it has to come from God's Word. And this was the great thing about this fellow Joseph, was the very fact that there was a triumph in his faith. That triumph showed itself that even though I have been sold as a slave, even though I have been abused, even though I have been mistreated, even though I've been lied about and I've been put in jail on a false charge, I am going to stand by the moral, ethical life that I know is right because it's something that came from God. And so there is a triumph in faith that each of us needs to learn about. Well, let's go on and notice a few other things about this fellow Joseph. Joseph was put in jail on a false charge. I've never been in jail. I've visited jails a couple of times, but I've never been in jail. But here's the thing. When Joseph was sold as a slave, and then Joseph was put in jail on a false charge, if that had been me, maybe I would have said to myself, I've had it. I've had it up to here. I don't want anything else to do with religion, Christianity, God, Christ, or anything, because so many things have turned against me. I've been trying to live right, but so many things have turned against me now, I'm just going to give it all up. No, Joseph didn't do that. Instead, Joseph was in Egypt for about 22 years before he finally was reunited with his brothers. Joseph learned that faith does not guarantee a problem-free life. I wish it did. I wish that I knew that my faith would protect me from the difficulties and the problems and the pitfalls and the abuses of life. It doesn't. What does faith do then? Faith does primarily one thing here. It equips us to be able to live and survive in whatever situation we find ourselves in. Paul made a great statement in the Philippian letter. I wish that I could adopt this in my life. After Paul said, I know what it is to be hungry. I know what it is to be full. I know what it is to have advantage. I know what it is to have disadvantage. I know what it is to be persecuted. I know what it is to be welcomed. My life has been filled with all of these opposing things, Paul said. But he said, I've learned something. He didn't say I was born this way. He didn't say it was a miraculous gift. He said, I have learned. In whatever state I am, therein to what? Be content. Therein to be content. Faith doesn't say to us, you will not have any more problems. I remember when I first started preaching, I baptized a man. He was from a fairly religious family, and but he left the religion of his family, and he was baptized. And he told me one day, he said, Jack, I have had more problems since I became a Christian than I ever had before I was a Christian. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, this doesn't work out the way I thought it was supposed to. No, because I didn't stop to think of the fact that faith does not remove us from problems. Faith many times creates problems. If you don't believe that, sit down and read some church history. And read the Bible, read the book of Acts, and see how faith resulted in persecution for so many of these people. And so Joseph's faith was something that did not guarantee that things would be all rosy for him, but it did guarantee something else. It guaranteed that as long as he stands with God, God would give him the power to survive. And so Paul learned that. He said, I have learned in whatever state I am, therein to be content. So what am I going to do about the problems of my life? Well, how am I going to handle those problems? Well, I'm going to handle those problems, hopefully, by saying to God, God, whatever problems come to me, my faith is going to sustain me. And so this is the idea. Faith doesn't guarantee a problem-free life, but it does guarantee us that we will have the perseverance of standing up in the face of things that are very difficult for us. To me, one of the most important things in the life of Joseph was that we learned something about his faith and forgiveness. I had two brothers. We were just like any other family, you know. Brothers fight with each other and get mad with each other and all this sort of thing. But there was never any doubt about the fact that we were brothers and that we were very close. And we, sometimes we didn't like each other, but we loved each other. You know what I'm talking about? And so Joseph now, he was sold as a slave by his brothers. When his brothers came finally to Egypt, the father died, many years had passed, and they got together just as I read in the text. The brothers got together and they said to themselves, well, our father is dead now. I wonder if Joseph is going to abuse us, if Joseph is going to get back at us, if Joseph is going to punish us. Because you see, at this time, Joseph was a prominent leader in the Egyptian economy. And so they made up this story. They said, well, before Father died, he said, tell Joseph that he is to forgive. Tell Joseph he is to forgive. There's not any indication that Jacob ever said that, his father, that Jacob ever said that. But that was something that they cooked up so that they would be relieved of what they were afraid was going to be the abuse of Joseph. And then Joseph came back and he says, I'm not God. I'm going to protect you. And so he forgave them of all the things that they had done against him. There used to be a bumper sticker years ago, or a little plaque of some kind. I've forgotten which. I've seen it in a number of different ways, and it was a little slogan. It was supposed to be funny, but unfortunately, it reflects, I think, a great deal of what the culture around us really says. And it says, "I don't get mad, I get even." Well, the whole idea is that if you do something bad to me, I'm going to see to it that something really bad happens to you. Not with Joseph. You see, faith says, forgive. Faith says, love. Faith says, bring things back together. Now, that isn't what our culture says. Our culture says, yes, if someone abuses you, have that person punished in some way. You've got a right to get angry. You've got a right now to get back at them. But faith says, no, forgive. In the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul has been talking about wonderful things that ought to be incorporated in the Christian life. And then he makes this statement, "Beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place to the wrath of God. For it is written, I will repay, says the Lord. Vengeance is mine." So if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing you shall heap coals of fire upon his head. And be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, this idea of heaping coals of fire on his head is not the idea of personal vengeance, but it's the idea instead that when we treat someone well, when we treat them good, when they deserve to be abused or punished, when we forgive them instead of seeking revenge, that person suffers because he sees the difference between what's good, what's right, and what's evil, and what's wrong. And when he sees that, this causes him to suffer. That's the idea of the passage. And so the second thing that Paul says is that vengeance is not ours. I don't have the right to take vengeance on someone. I would like to sometime, and we all probably would like to sometime, because sometimes things are very, very bad. If someone abused one of my children, I would want to take vengeance on that person. Not just punish him, but I would like to take vengeance on that person. But Paul says, it's written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Vengeance is God's right. It's not my right. And so, in contrast to this, he says, when someone does something evil to you, do something good for them. When someone abuses you, instead of saying, I'll get you back, the Bible teaches, let's do something good for them. Now, does that work all the time? Oh, no, that didn't work all the time. In Proverbs, he says, a soft answer turns away wrath. but evil words stir up anger. Well, does that work? Yes, generally speaking, it works. Not always. A soft answer doesn't always calm the troubled waters, but a soft answer, generally speaking, will turn away wrath. It's very, very difficult for somebody to oppose a person who is meek and gentle. And yet, if we fight fire with fire, what are we going to do? We're just going to make more fire, that's all. And Joseph, when he came along here, his father died, his brothers come and they say, forgive us. Joseph says, not only will I forgive you, I'll take care of you. Joseph was in a position to do that. He says, I'll take care of you. I'll see to it that life is good for you. And that's what faith can do for us. When faith controls us, it doesn't relieve us of the trials, but it assures us that we can live with the consequences. If you're not a Christian tonight and you want to become a Christian, you can do so by coming to be baptized into Christ upon the confession of your faith and upon the repentance in your heart. We're going to sing an invitation song, and if you're subject to the invitation, we invite you to come. Let's stand together, please.